is genuinely signed Threatening Dave. That's who it's from.
Okay.
And this was inspired by hearing the... do you remember the one a couple of weeks ago? Leave my wife alone. That one.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
the phone call.
The one with the affair.
The prank phone call where it turned out that actually there was an affair going on. Okay. Father Simon and the Forgiving Collective says, Threatening Dave, listening to a confession a few weeks ago reminded me of an incident that I thought was long buried in my memory since it happened back in the 1990s when everyone agrees there were different times.
Yeah.
I was working in a large company where my work often involved visiting other departments. In one of these departments worked a young woman, we'll call her Sue, whose boyfriend, we'll call him Pete, also worked in the same department. Sue had her own house, and Pete was a regular visitor first thing in the morning to make sure she was okay.
Okay. Yeah.
If you understand. Now, Pete, as young lads do, like to go out for a few bevies, and on the day in question, he'd been out the previous night against Sue's express advice, and apparently not calling in to Sue's until the early hours, and then falling asleep in a heap on the floor and not going into work. Sue was not impressed. When I went into their office the next day, Sue gave me a phone, a scrap of paper with a phone number on it, and said, ring this number, it's my house. Pete will answer it. I want him to keep getting woken up so he can't sleep his hangover off. It seems she'd been collaring random people all morning to keep ringing Pete.
Okay.
Yeah. What should I say? I asked. Well, just make something up, came the reply. Now, unbeknownst to Sue, I had some acting experience, having played the critically unacclaimed role of fourth villager in The Puppeteer's Tale at school, so felt free to let my imagination wander once I worked out what my motivation was.
Good.
I thought for a few moments and then rang the number. A sound of answered the phone. In my most threatening voice, Threatening Dave continues, I said, Pete, about last night. My man will be round shortly for the merchandise. You've still got it, haven't you? There's a pause for a few seconds, and obviously Pete's brain fog is still in evidence. Yes? Came the slurred response. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
So I continued. Good, well, don't let him down. He'll be keeping an eye on your place. My man can be very, persuasive.
I'll bet he can.
When he needs to be. He's parked outside in a black car, so only leave if you've got the merchandise for him. Don't try a runner, because Mr. Grout would be very upset.
Mr. Grout.
And you don't want to upset Harry Grout, do we? So I put the phone down before Pete could reply. A couple of minutes later, Sue gets a call from Pete. Seemingly had sobered up rapidly, and it seems that, here's the thing, by chance, there actually was a man sat in a black car down the road from her house, and he looked like a ruffian.
Yeah.
Pete was terrified and was wondering if there was any way of escaping through the back garden, because he wasn't quite so au fait with Sue's place, and it turns out there wasn't. Sue asked me what I'd said to Pete, because she'd not heard the original conversation. I briefly explained some of the story, feeling guilty that perhaps my acting and plot lines had been a little bit too drastic and realistic, but apparently far from it. Ring him again in 10 minutes, says Sue. Put the frighteners on him. What? Just a little bit more. Okay. So I ring. Is that Pete? Yes. My man is still waiting. He'll call round and remind you. Make sure you don't forget our arrangement. He's not the patient sort. He's prone to, getting carried away. Keep the cutlery drawer closed when you're
what?
Sue took the afternoon off, went home to find Pete hiding behind the sofa, armed with a frying pan, trembling and shaking.
Oh, dear.
Fearing that the mafia were outside. She questioned him about who he had actually met and what he had agreed to last night. He thought there might have been some tattoos and kebabs involved, but he wasn't sure. And it was only when she pointed out that the car across the road was now just an old Reliant Robin that he calmed down. Clearly the mob had moved on. However, I do need to confess to Sue, who was unaware of the extent of the threats that my character, threatening Dave, actually made on the phone towards Pete, and to poor Pete, who never knew it was a colleague who threatened him with a heavy mob on behalf of Grouty, who, of course, was a character in Porridge.
Of course, yeah.
But he obviously didn't twig, so maybe he was a bit thick. But on the plus side, I'm just editorialising there.
Yeah.
On the plus side, next time he went out drinking, he only had a couple of shandies and was very grateful to everyone who spoke to him, and he seemed like a nice guy in the end. Anyway, so let's just see, again, a top fade.
Yeah.
Let's see what threatening Dave gets out of Sister Susie, the voice of responsibility.
Well, threatening Dave, you know, when given a task, you really do go for it. Like, that is, you didn't just ring up and pester him and keep him awake from sleeping his hangover off. You went to town, and I do applaud you for that. But I just think, you know, and also maybe Pete was just a bit too young to know the man from Porridge, because I didn't know the man from Porridge either.
Grouty.
Yeah, didn't know Grouty.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
But I think it was a bit mean, and he probably was terrified, and his hangover was probably bad enough, so I'm not going to forgive you.
Also,
threatening
I mean,
Dave.
that sounded like Ray Winston had called him up.
It did.
Exactly right.
Did
Brother from another gutter.
Well, I'm going to forgive, and I'm going to say, here's the thing. This comes under the category of what are the chances? The fact that you mentioned a guy in a black car, and that happens to be a guy in a black car outside.
Yes.
What are the chances? That was never going to happen. And also, is it a crime to be so convincing in your acting?
Thank
I
you.
have to say, like myself, then definitely not, because anyone who's witnessed my acting over the last 6 months will agree with me there. So I'm going to forgive.